Hi, everybody. We're delighted to have so many of you join us today as we discuss Oregon's proposed rules to implement its climate protection program. My name is Melissa Powers, and I am a law professor at Lewis and Clark Law School, where I also direct the Green Energy Institute. I am joined today by GEI's two staff attorneys, Kara Saylor, who will be jointly presenting with me, and Amelia or Amy Slusher, who served on the Regulatory Advisory Committee to create the rules that we're going to be talking about today, and who will join us in the Q&A section at the end of this presentation. If you do have a question as we work through the presentation, please go ahead and post it in the Q&A forum, and we will be reserving time at the end to get to any of the questions that folks may have.
Hi, so welcome to you all. We're happy you could take an hour of your day to learn about this new important proposed program. I'm going to start with a little background. The Climate Protection Program is the product of rulemaking, which was initiated by the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. The rules, which are currently in draft form, are intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from significant sources in Oregon. They are also intended to prioritize equity by promoting benefits to environmental justice communities disproportionately burdened by the effects of climate change and air pollution. These draft rules came about as a result of a series of events, beginning with the Republican walkouts on proposed cap and trade legislation, which was early in 2020. Governor Brown then issued an Executive Order 2004, which directed various agencies to implement climate-related initiatives. And one of those directions was to DEQ, to adopt a program to cap and reduce emissions. So DEQ engaged with stakeholders in a series of workshops over the summer and fall of 2020, and GEI was there at every single one. It then convened a rules advisory committee, which began meeting just in January of this year to develop the program. And as Melissa mentioned, our colleague Amy was appointed to that committee and offered extensive feedback on the formation of the rules. So today we'll describe the draft rules for the program that DEQ will propose to the Environmental Quality Commission for consideration. I'll just note that nothing in the draft rules is guaranteed to appear in the final rules. The EQC is the final decision maker on whether the proposed rules are adopted as final regulations. And in fact, DEQ may well change the rules in response to comments. So if something we say today inspires you, you have a few opportunities to share your opinions with the agency. You may submit written comments by October 4th at 4 p.m. In addition, or alternatively, the Environmental Quality Commission is holding a meeting from 4 to 7 this Thursday. We'll follow up this event with some links to information about how you may comment if you're interested. And it's helpful to submit comments, both in favor of regulation and identifying problems that you see with the program.
So here's where we're going to be headed for the rest of our presentation. First, because these rules include a significant component of the program, because the program has on a significant level requirements that mirror cap and trade, we're going to talk a little bit about how cap and trade programs work in theory and in practice. Then we're going to dive into some of the details of the cap and trade component of the climate protection program. Next, we're going to talk about a subset of the program which establishes best available emissions reduction technology requirements that apply to certain facilities. Finally, we're going to talk about some recommended improvements that we have before we undertake questions. So let's talk first of all about how cap and trade works in concept, and then we'll compare that conceptual idea to how the climate protection plan is going to work. So the majority of the emissions under the CPP or Climate Protection Program are addressed through a cap and reduce program. This program has several features that are often part of emissions trading or cap and trade programs, So before we dive into those specifics, we are going to explain just a little bit about how cap and trade works. The first step in cap and trade is figuring out the scope of a program's coverage. Will it be economy-wide, sector-specific, or somewhere in between? Once that is decided, regulators then set the cap, or the maximum amount of allowable emissions. They do this by establishing what's called the emissions baseline, which is usually set based on the historical emissions of the entities that are going to be covered by the cap. Regulators then usually require that cap to decline over time, as this image is illustrating. In the case of greenhouse gases, most programs are designed to lower the cap several times over several years. Sources under the cap then each receive emissions allowances. Each allowance is typically equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent. Thus, for each allowance a source receives, during each compliance period, the source may emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. Some programs allocate emissions allowances via an auction, which basically means that the covered sources have to bid to buy the amount of allowances that they need, while some programs give allowances to emitters for free. And many use a mix of both free and paid for allowances. Now, at the end of each of the compliance period, covered entities are required to surrender or turn into the regulators the amount of allowances that represent the actual source's emissions. If sources have extra allowances, as pictured in the circular part of the slide, they can sell or bank them. So in this case, the blue source's emissions fall below the cap. So the blue has extra emissions allowances. It can sell those to the red source, which has over emitted, or the blue source can decide instead to bank or hold on to its emissions allowances until a future compliance period when its obligations are going to become more stringent. For source, the red source here in the middle of the slide, if it has emitted too much, it either has to get emissions allowances from somewhere else, or it is going to be subject to a significant penalty. Now, in concept, cap and trade is relatively simple. There are a finite number of allowable emissions, and those who are covered under the program can either comply on their own or they can buy emissions allowances from somewhere else. But there are a lot of rules that get developed to implement emissions trading. And many of these rules have led to a number of different questions, just a few of which I'm going to present here. Number one, why should sources be given allowances for free, especially when those allowances have value? They can be sold to someone else. Number two, why shouldn't regulators just require everybody to meet their own emissions requirements? In other words, why allow trading at all? Number three, how long should allowances last? If an emitter receives 100 allowances during a compliance period and it only emits 90 tons of carbon dioxide, and it decides not to sell those emissions to somebody else, can it use those allowances later during the compliance periods when things are going to become much more stringent? If so, is there a risk that they will accumulate a bunch of allowances early when the cap is easier to comply with and apply those later when the expectation is that emissions are going to be much, much lower than they are in the earlier periods of time? Now, another issue that often arises in terms of traditional cap and trade programs is the use of offsets. Most cap and trade programs actually allow emissions reductions from entities that are not covered under the cap to be used to comply with the cap. These external compliance tools are called offsets. And the most common type of offset comes from forest protection and carbon sequestration projects, most of which are located, or many of which are located in other countries, and most of which depend on land use activities to sequester or reduce emissions. Now, the idea behind these programs is that because carbon dioxide affects climate change on a global basis, reductions in carbon dioxide anywhere are good. So rather than reducing its own emissions, a covered entity could instead pay somebody else to reduce their emissions. And since it's often less expensive to reduce emissions through land use related activities, especially in developing countries, many offset programs involve these land use activities. These programs have become very controversial, however, in part because many of the offset projects have failed, or they are very hard to monitor and very hard to verify. As a result, especially of the failed programs, there are situations in which entities that are covered under the existing cap and trade programs have been allowed to continue their emissions, which is what offsets allow, but they are not actually yielding net emissions reductions because of the failure of land use-based programs. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about these offset programs and some of the concerns, I encourage you to look at some of the articles that ProPublica has published. It talks a lot about some big failures in various types of offset projects. Now, one thing I want to note here is that the Oregon Climate Protection Program so far does not include these types of external offsets. And it doesn't allow for land use activities to qualify for the type of offset that the CPP does allow, which we'll talk about in just a minute. We think this is a strength of the program, and we hope that DEQ is going to retain this aspect of the program. So cap and trade has been a controversial program for a number of years, and there's been a lot of research done on its efficacy. So there are some general areas where researchers generally agree that cap and trade has succeeded, but as a general matter, those successes have been relatively narrow. So to date, based on the experiences of other states and countries that have used emissions trading programs, researchers generally agree that cap and trade has the following realistic benefits. Number one, it can generate revenue for emissions reductions activities in clean energy development, especially if the law actually allows regulators to create programs that can generate revenue, whether it's through auctioning of emissions, charging a fee for the trading, or otherwise creating programs that will require the covered entities to dedicate funding towards clean energy. Number two, cap and trade often acts as a backstop to other emissions reduction programs. So for example, if there are renewable energy mandates or other types of programs designed to incentivize clean energy, cap and trade acts as a backstop that prevents emissions from increasing above that cap. Number three, a fair amount of research indicates that narrower programs tend to work a little bit better, largely because they're easier to administer. Whereas, although broader programs can capture more emissions, for them to work, there generally has to be a more robust regulatory program, which can actually be challenging to create. So as Kara is about to explain, the CPP's cap and reduce program is narrower in scope than other economy-wide programs that you might be familiar with, such as that in California. As a result, it's a bit simpler. While there are areas that we think would benefit from improvement and more ambition, we also tend to think that this relative simplicity is a benefit of the Oregon program.
So how does the climate protection program work? Just as in a traditional cap and trade program, DEQ will set a cap, lowers over time, requires covered entities to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. This part of the program will cover approximately 30 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So whose emissions are covered under the cap? The cap applies to two categories of fuels: natural gas or fossil gas, and transportation fuels. So the three natural gas utilities that supply nearly all the natural gas used in homes and industrial facilities here in Oregon: as well as suppliers of gasoline, diesel, kerosene, or propane, they all must comply with the cap. The program has emissions thresholds for non-natural gas fuel suppliers that decline over time. So in the initial compliance period, only the large fuel suppliers must comply with the cap. As the emissions threshold declines, smaller and smaller fuel suppliers will also become subject to the cap. Again, just as in a traditional cap and trade program, to comply with the cap, covered fuel suppliers must surrender a compliance instrument for each ton of emissions. If a source emits 1 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emission, they must surrender 1 million compliance instruments. Compliance will be determined from the fuel supplier's greenhouse gas reports. And what's interesting is no specific emissions reduction strategy is mandated. Instead, covered fuel suppliers may select their own compliance strategies. That might include electrification of buildings and transportation, energy efficiency, and alternative fuels. If a covered fuel supplier is unable to demonstrate compliance, it will be subject to penalties. So there's a lot we like about this program. This is the only proposed regulation of direct use natural gas emissions in Oregon. Oil companies selling in Oregon will be held accountable to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Strong near-term emissions reductions and related investments will provide opportunities which will benefit our public health and economic growth. And finally, Oregon's falling behind its neighbors in adopting strong climate policy. The CPP helps keep Oregon in line with California and Washington's climate policies.
Now, how is the CPP different from broader cap and trade programs? Well, first, as the heading indicates, it's a narrower program. And this narrowness is, we think, a benefit in large part because, as Kara mentioned, it is going to apply primarily to fuels. This should make the program simpler to implement than other broader programs. But it also means that other sources that emit greenhouse gases are also going to have to be regulated through other mechanisms. As we'll talk about, this is operationalized in some contexts, and there are other sources that we think are maybe going to escape regulation. Second, unlike other programs that generate revenues from auctioning off the emissions allowances or taxing and charging a fee on the trades, DEQ does not have the legal authority to do either. Under DEQ's existing laws, DEQ is allowed to collect permit fees, but only up to the amount that those fees pay for DEQ's administrative costs. And DEQ does not believe that it has the authority on its own to set up an emissions allowance trading program. So in effect, what DEQ has done is it's designed a cap system, and then it's told covered entities to figure out how they will comply either individually or collectively. And then at the end of the 3-year compliance period, each entity needs to surrender the required amount of emissions allowances. If they don't have enough allowances, they will pay a penalty. But DEQ is not actively involved in the trading component of this rule. Third, unlike typical cap and trade, the CPP does not allow for the use of these broad offsite forest and land use related offset projects. We personally think that this is good because these projects are difficult to manage. And if the offset projects fail, such as, for example, if a wildfire causes a forest preservation program to burn, they can result in tens of millions of increased emissions as opposed to emissions reductions. Now, in lieu of the offset project, the CPP is instead using a mechanism known as community climate investments. Community climate investments require covered entities, if they opt to use these, to pay a DEQ set fee, which will be used to fund projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions in environmental justice communities. These projects in these environmental justice communities will include things like the deployment of clean energy technologies such as electric vehicles and high efficiency electric heat pumps. As the cap lowers through the program, The CC use can increase. It begins at 10% of a compliance obligation, and it can go up to accounting for 20% of an entity's compliance period. CCIs are then designed to mitigate the cost impacts that would be felt by the communities as carbon dioxide emissions are supposed to reduce. We expect that costs are going to increase for fuels. So by deploying clean energy technologies into those communities that are probably the least likely to be able on their own to afford the emissions reductions, will ultimately allow for the deployment of clean energy in the hardest hit communities. It will also benefit those communities by mitigating air pollution, especially disproportionate air pollution exposure that contributes to environmental injustice. It will increase jobs in various communities, and it will ultimately jumpstart some of the deployment of the technology that is going to be necessary to facilitate decarbonization. In effect, CCIs are going to require fossil fuel companies to pay for the technologies that are necessary to reduce fossil fuel reliance. And we need to deploy those technologies to allow fossil fuel use to decline. So there's some questions about how CCIs are going to be implemented. Those questions are going to be resolved at a future date. We think that implementation is going to be very important. But at this particular point, we think that CCIs are, generally speaking, a positive distinction and different approach from the offsets that are common under cap and trade. Now, the final difference is that some sources, like cement manufacturers and other facilities, are not going to be subject to the emissions cap. Instead, they are going to be subject to a requirement known as best available emissions reduction, which Kara is going to talk about.
Yeah, so we'll move on to the second discrete part of the CPP, and this is called the BEAR program. So as Melissa just mentioned, BEAR stands for Best Available Emissions Reduction. This part of the program applies to some existing and newly permitted stationary sources. As Melissa mentioned, cement processing is one, others are semiconductor manufacturing. It requires an entity to apply the best available emissions reduction strategy to reduce emissions at that specific source or type of source. It covers only those emissions that are not already regulated under the cap. So these sources are covered entities if their emissions meet or exceed a threshold of 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. To give you some idea of what that means, currently DEQ plans to regulate emissions from 13 existing sources through this BEAR program. So once the BEAR strategy has been determined, it will be incorporated in the permit, and the covered source must submit an annual report on its progress toward implementing the BEAR determination. The source must also report to DEQ every 5 years, identifying all the strategies available at that time that it could use to reduce its emissions. While some aspects of the BEAR part of the climate protection program are good and we like them, so the purpose of the program is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on site while also reducing co-pollutants on site. Such an approach could significantly reduce air contamination in environmental justice communities, which is where most of these sources are located. And in addition, because these sources are not subject to the cap, they also are not permitted to engage in trading. But as you can tell from our presentation so far, while we support some parts of the CPP, we do think there are aspects of the program that could be improved. So Melissa and I will now share some of our thoughts on that piece. In short, we remain concerned about the emissions cap trajectory and targets. We're also concerned about what we call the power plant loophole and some aspects of BEAR.
Okay, so first of all, and above all, we think that the cap in this program is simply too high. It does not ever aim to achieve zero emissions, which is inconsistent with climate science. Instead, it aims to reduce emissions by 45% by 2035 and then 80% by 2050. We think at a minimum that the emissions reduction should be 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. Where are we getting these numbers? Well, we're getting these numbers from different emissions trajectories that project what the emissions reductions need to be if we are to have half a chance of limiting temperature increases to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and a likely chance of limiting temperature increases to no more than 2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. Now, just to put these numbers in perspective, we right now are living in a world where average temperatures have increased by about 1 degree Celsius in comparison to average pre-industrial temperatures. It's the highest concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that we have experienced in hundreds of thousands of years. And we are experiencing the impacts already of the consequences of that 1 degree temperature increase that we have already experienced. Anybody who lives in the Pacific Northwest has experienced, among other things, heat waves, the wildfires from both the summer and then last summer most intensively. We have also been in the midst of a prolonged drought in many parts of the Pacific Northwest. And when we move beyond the Pacific Northwest, we're seeing unprecedented levels of floods and hurricanes. We're all experiencing these random super cold periods through the polar vortices and a host of other impacts as a result of climate change. So as we're living in our 1 degree world, I think we're getting a sense of why it is so important for us to make sure that we do not go beyond a 2 degree world. So the emissions reductions in this slide show us on the red what it would look like to have emissions reductions, ensure that we have half a chance of keeping ourselves at 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's the red lines, and to be on a trajectory for 2 degrees Celsius, that is the blue line. Now, one thing I just want to note is that to have a 1.5 degree future, we need to see emissions reduced by 50% by 2032, and to get to zero emissions by 2050, at which point we need to start going negative in terms of our emissions, which means we have to start pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. On a 2 degree Celsius path, we should be at 50% by 2035 and at zero by 2065. So where is the Oregon program? It's those 2 yellow stars in this map. And what we can see is that we are not anywhere near the trajectory we need to be for a 1.5 degree future, nor are we on track to be at a 2 degree future in terms of the lowest emissions levels that we need to achieve. In fact, we're not even aiming for zero. So this is one area where we think we need to see the greatest improvement. Sorry.
So the other thing that we're concerned about is what we're calling the power plant loophole. So under the draft rules, emissions from electric power plants are currently exempt from the CPP. And from the beginning, GEI questioned DEQ's decision not to regulate electric power plants. However, this past legislative session, the Clean Energy for All bill, or HB 2021, was enacted. And that law requires electricity sold in Oregon to be 100% clean by 2040. So DEQ is still maintaining its position on exempting electric power plants from the CPP, noting now that it wants to avoid double regulation of power plants. So our concern is that power plants that are currently regulated under HB 2021 could be sold to entities that are not subject to HB 2021. For example, if an investor-owned utility like PGE or PacifiCorp, both of which are subject to HB 2021, were to sell a gas-fired power plant to a private company to produce Bitcoin, for example, those emissions would not be regulated under any existing law or regulation in Oregon. And emissions from power plants present serious equity concerns for nearby communities who are disproportionately impacted by emissions from these facilities. We think DEQ should close this loophole and should regulate power plants that aren't otherwise regulated under HB 2021. As Melissa told me earlier when we were talking about this, in our view, there's no reason not to regulate the future more stringently than we do the present.
Related to this is the strengths, the areas of improvement related to BEAR. So we think that the BEAR program needs to be strengthened in a couple of ways. First, under the program right now, existing sources are supposed to ask the Department of Environmental Quality to set source-specific technology standards based on what DEQ and the source believe represent the best available emissions reduction technology. Now, while these types of source-specific requirements are pretty common under statutes like the Clean Air Act, they are usually accompanied with a clear emissions cap or an emissions limitation. Right now, under DEQ's proposal, there's the technology assessment, but it's not accompanied with a cap. And we think that there should be a cap to accompany the technology-based standard. Now, the other problem that we see with BEAR has to do with new stationary sources. So as Kara mentioned, there are about 13 entities in Oregon right now that would be eligible for BEAR. Now, the theory of allowing these 13 entities to be subject to BEAR is that these are particularly trade exposed industries. The concern is that if they are subject to emission standards and they are operating in competitive industries, they may not be able to operate as successfully and economically based on the differential types of regulation that apply across borders and outside of the United States and so forth. So the BEAR provision is designed to protect existing entities. We do not see any reason why future sources would ever be allowed to escape the most stringent emissions limitations possible. It just doesn't make sense in terms of the trade exposure issue, and nor does it make sense in terms of climate change. We simply cannot afford to be building new facilities today that are going to lock in emissions for decades to come. So among the changes that we need to see is the change associated with limiting the BEAR provision only to that handful of existing sources. So what are some of the takeaways before we turn to the Q&A? First is that despite the shortcomings that we just mentioned, we do think that overall the CPP deserves our support. It is certainly better than the status quo, which is no regulation at all. And we also think especially that the CCIs could be a really important tool, both to accelerate the deployment of clean energy technology in environmental justice communities around the state, as well as to facilitate a quicker transition away from fossil fuels, because the deployment of that technology is a necessary prerequisite to equitable reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and associated fossil fuel use. We also think that the CPP, as long as trading is relatively moderate, could ultimately incentivize covered sources to install innovative technology, well, that will cost them some on the front end to begin to deploy more clean energy technology. We think that it will save them money in the long term as their overall fuel use begins to drop. Now, we do expect that fuel costs are going to rise as a result of this program. However, the CCIs serve as a really important cost mitigator. And so we, again, think that that's an important component of the program. And finally, and above all, we strongly encourage DEQ to strengthen the trajectory of this program and to lower the cap so that we really are planning for an economy that is going to function at zero greenhouse gas emissions. The reality is we simply cannot afford to be less ambitious. So those are some of our overarching thoughts about the CPP. We see that we have some questions. So
And I'll just note, there's some answers to questions. Amy's been busy at work behind the scenes answering some questions. One of the questions that came in was, does rural Oregon qualify as an EJ community? And the answer to that is yes. And then she's also provided a link to the 13 BEAR entities that are subject to regulation. And then we've got a couple of really good questions that are in there. Amy, do you want to join us?
Sure, thanks, Kara. So I will read out the questions, and then if you and Melissa want me to try to answer them, then I will, but I'll shoot them over to you first. So Jessica Kleiss, or Kleis, I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, asks essentially how businesses like natural gas suppliers and transportation fuel suppliers, gas stations, oil companies, how can those types of sources reduce their emissions?
Yeah, so the idea is that those entities will use alternative fuels potentially. They'll also impose efficiencies. And then with the increase of electrification, declines in emissions will occur. And then, of course, also purchasing the CCI credits, which they can use, as Melissa explained, in an increasing amount over the course of the program, beginning with 10%. Amy, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure, yeah, I think that's a great answer, Kara. I would add, so there are a number of strategies that sources can apply to reduce their emissions under the program. The program isn't prescriptive. It doesn't prevent sources from really doing anything from reducing emissions, nor does it require regulated entities to engage in certain types of activities. So I recognize that it can be kind of difficult to wrap your head around how these fuel suppliers can be required to reduce emissions, because most of those emissions are actually occurring at the consumer level. When you drive your car and you're burning gasoline, you're producing greenhouse gas emissions. When you heat your house with natural gas, you're producing greenhouse gas emissions. And so anything that the consumer could do to reduce emissions, like replacing your gas furnace with high efficiency electric heat pumps, or selling your gas vehicle, or decommissioning your gas vehicle and buying an electric vehicle, those are the same types of strategies that regulated fuel suppliers could use to reduce their emissions. Okay, so Steve asks, some public community colleges and universities emit more than 25,000 scope 1 metric tons of carbon dioxide. Will they, or facilities like Lewis and Clark, be regulated under the program? I'm happy to take this one if you guys, okay. So the short answer is no. Those facilities will not be directly regulated under the BEAR approach that's in the proposed rules. The BEAR approach only applies to process-based greenhouse gas emissions. So those are greenhouse gases that are produced through an industrial process itself, like the production of cement or semiconductors. However, all natural gas or methane gas that is sold and used in Oregon, so sold by natural gas utilities like Northwest Natural, Avista, or Cascade Natural Gas, all of those emissions will be subject to the emissions cap. So facilities like colleges and universities, as well as homeowners that have natural gas furnaces, all of those facilities would not be subject to regulation under the program, but the fuels that they use will have to reduce their greenhouse gases over time. It's just that the utilities themselves will be ultimately responsible for achieving those emissions reductions.
So I'll go ahead and take the question about the legal authority that DEQ has to regulate. And just to, in part, because I think there's a little bit of confusion about how the executive order operates vis-a-vis DEQ's existing laws. So very basically, DEQ has broad authority under its clean air laws, which are duly enacted statutes under Oregon law, that allow it to promulgate regulations to regulate air contaminants that come from sources if DEQ determines that those air contaminants affect either public health, which basically means human health, or the environment, which would include the climate. So the reason that there's been a little bit of confusion in terms of DEQ's regulatory authority is because the governor issued an executive order that directed all agencies to use their existing legal authorities to regulate, and then specifically directed DEQ to develop its own regulatory program. So some people have misconstrued that direction to suggest that DEQ, but for the executive authority, wouldn't have that authority. That's not right. DEQ has authority under its existing laws. The executive order is more the policy push that DEQ needed to ultimately develop this regulatory program. Now, one might ask, why didn't DEQ regulate earlier? And the short answer is that DEQ didn't regulate earlier because I think it, like many people, was waiting for the legislature to pass its own greenhouse gas emissions restrictions. And of course, as Kara noted at the beginning, that didn't happen. One other note, actually, that I should mention is that although DEQ has broad authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, it is not allowed to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and from forest-related activities, which is why the scope of this program is focused on fossil fuels in anthropogenic emissions as opposed to biogenic emissions. And so there's also been some confusion about whether DEQ is going to regulate emissions from the forest sector, the ag sector, and the short answer is no, because it's statutorily prohibited from doing so.
And I'll take some of the questions about the CCIs. There are a couple of good questions. I'll tell you that the rules are somewhat prescriptive about how the process will work. It's hard, of course, to contemplate what might happen in the future. So DEQ is attempting to sort of set up some structures, but essentially what will happen is that these covered fuel suppliers, right, entities that are covered under the cap, they contribute funds to third-party entities. So the funds never enter DEQ's coffers. They go to the third-party entities that have been have applied to DEQ to participate as these community climate investment entities to complete projects, right, that they have planned for and have proposed that have to have emissions reductions. So in addition, I think it might be helpful to know that an equity advisory committee will be set up. There's a process in the rules to do this, to assist DEQ in both approving CCI entities and their projects. So there will be some opportunity for, I know there's a question about renters, concern about low-income individuals. So this equity advisory committee is set up to, in part, vet some of those issues that are likely to arise. And the other thing is that the CCI contribution amounts are set in the rules. They start at $81. This is 2021 dollars for the first part of the program. Amy, did you want to add anything about CCIs?
Yeah, I can answer a few of the questions related to low income impacts. First, Eric asked, are there examples of CCI programs working? And the answer is yes. California has a program that's very similar to this under their cap and trade program. It's generated billions of dollars for projects in environmental justice communities. And as far as I know, has been considered pretty successful. So then there are a few questions about how the program will mitigate impacts to low-income communities and environmental justice communities. And the short answer is that the CCI mechanism is the intended mitigation policy within the climate protection program. As Melissa and Kara noted, the program is very constrained by DEQ's existing legal authority and their lack of authority to impose fees or sell allowances. So the Community Climate Investment Program is sort of a more creative approach to help raise money for projects in environmental justice communities and low-income communities. The program defines environmental justice communities fairly broadly. So it includes communities of color, communities experiencing lower incomes, tribal communities, rural communities, coastal communities, communities with limited infrastructure, and other communities traditionally underrepresented in public processes and adversely harmed by environmental and health hazards, including seniors, youth, and persons with disabilities. So as you can see, that definition is really broad. And so the CCI mechanism is intended to funnel investment into those communities. The reason that DEQ has authority to do this is because they won't be taking any money themselves. They do set a floor, a price floor for those credits, but the entire transaction is being done through bilaterally between the regulated entity and the approved CCI entity. Just make sure I'm not missing anything. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. I mean, so I will note that there are criteria for CCI projects. So to be eligible to generate a CCI credit, which represents 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent emissions, a project has to be located in Oregon and it has to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But then there are also additional criteria to prioritize projects that are located in environmental justice communities or provide meaningful co-benefits to those communities. So it's not directly a requirement that those projects are installed or developed in those communities, but they're very much prioritized and incentivized to benefit those communities. How about Kara and or Melissa, do you want to take this question about the environmental and climate impacts of generating electricity?
Sure. I mean, the short story is that the recently passed bit of legislation, HB 2021, has basically become the forum for regulating emissions from electric sources. And so it is going to ultimately get us down to 0 emissions by 2045, I believe. Is that right? 2045? 2050. 2050.
2040.
Thank you. Sorry, 2040. I went the wrong direction. But the way that it works is it applies right now to 2 types of entities, as Kara was mentioning. It applies to electric companies, which are the investor-owned utilities, and it applies to electric service suppliers, which are independent entities that deliver electricity directly to retail customers. So the scope of the owners of power plants today are covered under regulation under Oregon's law. The concern that we have is this divestment or the selling of these facilities to entities that aren't currently covered. And we think that covering those entities is going to be important to close a loophole, because you could imagine a situation where a current owner of a power plant might choose, instead of shutting that power plant down, to instead sell it to somebody else who wants to continue operating it and maybe operating it for a new purpose, such as for Bitcoin production. So there was a question about whether other states have basically foreclosed this type of resale of an existing plant owned by one entity to somebody else who wouldn't be regulated. I frankly am not sure about that. I don't know if there are any states that have prohibited that type of resale of a power plant. I'm more familiar with the scenarios in which it's happened. So there are, I mean, there are for the investor-owned utilities, actually, there are rules that have required plants to be fully closed. And so if you take with an investor-owned utility and require it to actually close the plant, the investor-owned utilities would be subject to that mandate and wouldn't be allowed to resell the facility. But for a plant that's not owned by an investor-owned utility, that's much harder to do as a matter of law. And then the other thing is right now, neither HB 2021 nor the Climate Protection Program has anything to say about the resale of plants. And so we think this is just one area that we have to address.
So we have a question about would DEQ regulate renewable natural gas production since the biomass is usually agriculturally based? Do either of you want to take that one? Or do you want me to?
Go ahead, Amy. I'm scanning the other questions.
Okay. So unfortunately, because DEQ lacks legal authority, they're prohibited under state law to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, well, carbon dioxide emissions from biomass, which includes all kinds of biofuels, including renewable natural gas. So under the program, DEQ is effectively forced to give renewable natural gas a carbon intensity value of 0, meaning that if a fuel provider substitutes a certain portion of its fossil-based fuels with renewable natural gas or other types of biofuels, those biofuels are automatically assumed to be 0 emissions under the program. There will be record keeping associated with that fuel use. So the way that compliance will actually be determined under the program will be based on the emissions that regulated entities report through their greenhouse gas emissions reports that they have to submit annually to DEQ. And so under those greenhouse gas emissions reports, companies are required to report emissions from biofuels. So we will be tracking those emissions at the state level, but we won't be regulating those emissions under this program specifically.
So I'll take really quickly the question of what's the likelihood that this entire program will be delayed due to a legal challenge. And it's a two-parter. I think, first of all, I think it almost certainly will be challenged. Whether it will be delayed, though, I think is a little bit less clear because the opponents who would seek to challenge this rule in court would have to move basically to enjoin its implementation. And they would need to be able to show that they have a likelihood of success on the merits, showing that it is somehow unlawful and that there is a significant harm as a result of implementation of the law. We think that DEQ has done a pretty good job of walking the path, rather narrow path in terms of what it is allowed to do under the law. And so I think that it would be hard for an entity to challenge this as being impermissible under the existing laws of the state. And if they won't have that probability of success, I think it's going to be hard for them to also show that there's some type of irreparable harm. In particular, that irreparable harm would be harder to show because of the graduated way in which this program is ultimately going to be implemented. So in my view, I think it will be challenged, but I don't think that they will be able to stop its implementation, at least based on my reading of the law.
There's an interesting questions back to CCIs about whether the regulated entity gets to select which CCI it chooses to support. And so DEQ, remember, these are draft rules, and DEQ is trying to get at this issue. As it's currently drafted, covered fuel suppliers that contribute funds to any DEQ approved CCI entity has to contribute equal funds to all the CCI entities approved at that time. So I think they are trying to get at this issue of Northwest Natural not wanting to support electrification projects, for example. Advocates have been trying to give feedback to DEQ about how best to accomplish that issue. And GEI has submitted multiple rounds of comments on issues just like that, making sure that the CCI entities remain really quite separate from the entities that the covered fuel suppliers that are providing those funds.
Well, we have, I think, just a minute. And so unless there's one really quick last question, I think we're going to go ahead and sign off. We do encourage anybody who's interested to submit comments to DEQ related to these draft rules. And if you have further questions, feel free to reach out to us. And if we can, we will field them. Otherwise, thank you very much for spending an hour with us. And we look forward to seeing what happens next with this particular regulatory program. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.